and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, and today I'm joined by Crikey's climate contributor, Ketan Joshi, to discuss the policymaking state of play and how to stay optimistic in the face of it all. Ketan, thank you so much for joining me on Cut Through and being up very early today in Oslo to record this with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's not a problem. It's very lovely to be here.
It is a very busy time in the climate space this week. The coalition is yet again having an inter-party, interfactional brawl on their net zero policy, what stance they're going to take on that. They're having a series of closed-door meetings this week that will continue actually till even after this podcast is out. They have days still to figure this out. Abroad, COP30 is now underway, the UN Climate Change Conference. It is taking place in Brazil, will continue for roughly the next 10 or so days. The reports that are coming out from the conference already are very urgent, very fraught, as this kicked off with the confirmation that we look to have overshot the 1.5 degrees of global heating target. That was the best case scenario. So there's some fantastic news for everybody on a Friday. And in the background, rather than the foreground to all of this, the Labor government is indeed rolling out some of its promised policies on climate, environmental protection and energy. So there is a hell of a lot going on. Ketan, I want to get the coalition question out of the way first so that we can move on, hopefully with the rest of our lives after this. The back and forth on net zero policy that they're having, that they have been having, that they will continue to have. Are we paying too much attention to this, too little attention to this, just the right amount of attention? Like, what's the Goldilocks scenario as you see it?
It's a tricky one because the coalition, of course, is important. They're the other party of government in Australia. They were in government for almost a decade and they pulled the levers on climate policy for a long time, and they might do so after the next election. So their position matters a lot. But I think it's worth revisiting exactly what they're debating. And it's the inclusion of a two-word phrase, net zero, into their policy document or statement. And the rest of the statement is presumably not up for that much debate. The coalition has had a position on net zero for quite some time. Scott Morrison adopted a net zero target. I think it was soon after the Black Saturday bushfires. And it did not change the coalition's climate policy very much at all, right? They essentially have this delayist policy. I remember very well Scott Morrison explaining it. He drew a little line with his hand in a press conference and he said, no, you don't go down first and then, have a low amount of emissions after that. You kind of do nothing for a decade and then you go down once all the technological innovation comes through. Bill Gates met Scott Morrison around then and put that idea in his head. And so it didn't really matter that the coalition accepted net zero. They didn't suddenly become effective on climate. It didn't really seem to have a massive impact on industry. No one really was that impressed by it. If anything, it highlighted their hypocrisy even further. And so it's worth revisiting what happened when they adopted net zero to think about what happens when they drop it, which is probably not that much at all. Of course, there's the problem with the fact that the net itself in that phrase simply means that you can undo or neutralize emissions with offsets or carbon removals or carbon capture and storage. And that is something which itself has been quite contested. So in a sense, what they're debating on, which is seen as like a bellwether of whether or not they're accepting climate change or accepting the science, I'm doing air quotes for those listening, is really something which itself can enable delay or fossil fuels. So that's the context. So it's important in the sense that they're a big party and it could actually have sway at some point in the future a little bit, but they're debating something pretty minor and it's just become this transplant or symbol for other politics within the party. So to the extent that you care about how and why this group of adults squabble, I guess that could be something interesting if like political journalists follow that closely. But if you care about how it pulls the levers of Australia's climate policies, it's probably been somewhat exaggerated.
In some ways, maybe Scott Morrison was almost kind of spot on with his little stable line hand motion, because it doesn't, you're right in saying it doesn't really matter what they decide as the result of these meetings. To me, at least, it seems like they're going to play the role that they have been playing for the last decade, which is just to delay as much as possible. But the language that they use to do that, or the ideas that they put forward to do that, might change.
Yeah, and it's interesting to the extent that it is interesting. I think that it signifies that the party is being quite open. The coalition, that is being quite open about rejecting the need to reduce emissions at all. So they'll probably have something in there about like, oh yeah, we still acknowledge climate science. We still think it's real, and we still think emissions need to fall, but we would never force it ourselves. Where this statement really seems to be about whether or not you want to make emissions fall faster than they naturally would through the sort of organic deployment of new technologies. And that's really saying out loud that you don't want to protect your society from a harm is significant, right? In the same way that, like, if they came out and did a statement saying, yeah, road deaths are bad, but we don't ever want to try and reduce road deaths too aggressively, because we just want to wait for technological improvements to do it, like autonomous vehicles or sensors on cars. Would be a shocking thing to hear from a government, right? You sort of expect a government's job is to set about figuring out how to protect a society from a harmful technology, and that alone is significant. But then, even when you grant it that significance, a lot of the coverage I read treats it as if it's sort of a political spat, not an example of a major party flat out saying that we just don't feel like it's worth protecting our citizens from this particular type of harm.
Yeah, and a material harm as well. I do think a lot of the political reporting on not just this sort of like coalition, spat about it, but sometimes the policy reporting as well treats it as a conceptual thing, like an idea. I mean, it is intangible in a sense, but it is a material impact that is felt by everybody, regardless of whether they, agree with the policy or not, or whether they believe the science or not.
Exactly. Yeah.
We did have the news in the last week that we have passed the 1.5 degree heating benchmark. We are beyond that now. The goal is to stop any and all progress as much as possible towards the 2 degrees heating benchmark, which would be catastrophic. That's the reality that we exist in right now. That's the circumstances that we have right now. So I want to talk about Labor's role, because they're in the driver's seat here in Australia. They have the opportunity to work with some very motivated Greens and independents in the Senate to pass great climate policy, great energy policy, and all of the rest if they want to. But I am curious to know what you think of the policies that we've been seeing from the Labor government so far, because there has been a lot of activity. We had sort of recently the revised net zero targets. The response from some in the climate sector was quite negative, and others, I think, were not that bothered by it. There's also been the environmental protection reforms, still more detailed to come out. We don't exactly know what's going on with that. But again, some things looked kind of good there. Other things looked not so great. There's been an eagerness from the Labor government to pursue AI data centres across the country. Obviously, the continued approval of extensions to fossil fuel projects. Like I say, a lot going on. What picture does it paint of Labor's approach to this in reality? Like, are they responding to the changing circumstance that we are actually seeing?
Yeah, they are, in a bad way. So I guess starting like zoomed out quite significantly. I was listening to a really lovely interview with an academic who I've been following for a while. Her name is Jessica Green, and she writes about the way carbon trading and offsets and various types of greenwashing have become so embedded in climate policy that it's made us, to some degree, almost incapable of actually dealing with this problem. And so she basically highlights carbon offsets as an example of something, until we get rid of the option to pretend like we're taking action and have it treated as if it's like a serious thing, as if it's the same as taking real action, we're not going to solve this problem, because the problem is too hard and the temptation to fake it is too great. That really stuck with me. I thought that was a really great way of her putting it, because everywhere we kind of see the presence of some type of fakery of climate action, whether that's carbon offsets or whether it's setting a dodgy target full of loopholes, allowing, to basically say that you've reduced emissions when you've not really. That is an example of where you can very comfortably say that the person in charge is not taking the problem seriously. Because if you saw it as a real thing, if you saw the physical threat of it as something that threatens you and your family and your country, you just wouldn't allow fake action. And so again, just to use that car analogy, if we of course we recognize the threat of being killed on the roads as a real thing. People we know have died on the roads. It's just so physical and threatening. We get it. And so we would never ever allow a death offset to occur if you killed someone with your car through recklessness or speeding or drunk driving. You would never allow an offset to be granted if you went and saved someone from drowning at a beach or whatever. It just wouldn't. Society wouldn't accept that. And until we reach the exact same, what I would argue is a relatively normal headspace for a threatening problem for climate change, we're going to be stuck in the same rut. And so the Labour Party's policies that you sort of just ran through there, you can kind of find the same absence of urgency and the same feeling of wanting to fake solutions or to fake action. And perhaps a nice example is the way that Australia's fossil gas exports are framed as a climate solution. And so, like look at our gas going to these countries. They're using it to displace coal. But I have a piece out a few days ago with my Australia Institute hat on, analyzing what the power consumption for gas is in these countries, right? Power generation, I should say. And in the countries where Australia exports its gas to, it is not being used to displace coal. They're just burning it. They're just burning gas in power stations, and the dynamics of coal remain completely linked to climate policy and the presence or absence of wind and solar. And so it has nothing to do with Australia's gas being there or not being there. And so the reason that we see that stated so often and so strongly, people saying, oh, Australia's gas is solving climate change, again, is because they want to fake solutionism. And that's just a marker of unseriousness. It's a marker of denialism of the urgency or the threat of the problem, the physicality of it. And it's reflected all throughout other parts of Labor's domestic emissions policy. So something I've written a lot about is a safeguard mechanism, which just allows the purchase of offsets. Australia's transport policy, it has a vehicle efficiency standard. It's ridden with loopholes, particularly loopholes that allow very, very large and awful vehicles to present themselves as being efficient or within the bounds of allowances for the policy. And of course, you can trade if you are selling cars that are just excessively emissions intensive. You could just buy what are effectively offsets. This is an emissions trading scheme type policy. In the power sector, it's probably the area which Labor gets the most credit for, the most sort of positive news, and it's down to the fact that wind and solar are the cheapest modes of new generation. So there's just an inbuilt momentum into that system. However, something that I've done is compare it to Labor's own projections for when they first entered power in 2022. And it's disastrous. Australia's emissions are way higher than every single new government projections report that in the power sector that has been released every single year since they came to power. And I presume the ones that will come out in the next month or so, Australia's power sector will be above those projections too. And that's really bad. And you wouldn't know that because I think that the power sector is the area where people have struggled the most to give any real criticism to the Labor government because it's the most positive story.
Why is that? Why is that happening?
There is definitely a feeling that there needs to be a positive story on climate. And you mentioned the 1.5-degree target being
Yeah.
essentially breached before. It's been interesting seeing different reactions to it, right? So some people reacted to that by saying, well, yeah, that's pretty bad. But the truth is that in half a century, we could use carbon removal to suck carbon from the atmosphere and come back down to that level of planetary warming. And I think that's, I understand wanting to not tell a bad story or to tell a sad story, but I don't think that's something we should even really be talking very much about right now, let alone saying is guaranteed to be a thing we can do that's possible. I think that it's an example of where you kind of have to sit with grief and then let that turn into anger, and then let that anger turn into something that motivates you. Because, as I said on social media the other day, everything is still on the table, right? The 1.5 degree target was the best possible outcome for the hardest problem humanity has ever faced. So it's not that surprising that we didn't get it. It's good that we tried. It's very, very good that we tried. And the Pacific Islands nations that pushed for it initially 1 decade ago were right to push for it. But you also don't have to frame it as a positive that we've reached it. You don't have to reassure people. You have to be honest about what has happened here. And I think it's the same thing when you drill down to every single level, going from 1.5 degrees for the entire planet down to the story of wind and solar in Australia's power grid, right? Like rooftop solar deployments are slowing down. There is a very, very shocking undersupply of new large-scale wind and solar on Australia's power grid. It's not a depressing or pessimistic thing to raise that as a problem, right? I think that it's actually an energizing thing, because we know very, very well that with the right mix of policies, you can really eliminate coal and gas from power grids with far less hassle than we were ever told we would have if we got rid of those two technologies from power grids. There are so many examples around the world where we're seeing that you can get rid of coal and gas quicker than the sort of natural decay rate, like the natural shutdown rate for coal and gas on in terms of them retiring and new wind and solar being built. So the current rate at which Australia's power sector emissions are falling is way, way too slow, and it needs to be faster. We need to shut down coal in particular much, much faster. And that means building a large amount of new wind and solar. And it's hard to sell that as something people should be saying, because it sounds like you're kicking the one happy story that Australia has had on climate. And my point is always, yes, we get to enjoy a happy story once we fight with anger and with pressure and enthusiasm for making that happy story a reality. And the current mix of Australia's like deployment of renewable energy, that is the fruits of a lot of very ugly and intense fights in the 2010s around the renewable energy target, which was threatened to be cut by Tony Abbott in 2015. And we kind of had to fight to defend that policy. And I think that now that Australia is in a position where the Labor government is in power, it's not a fight to defend a policy, it's a fight to get them to create something more. And that has very different political dynamics, plus the fact that much of the climate and environment movement feels weird criticizing Labor. They feel slightly awkward or strange about it, and that's a problem.
Yeah, that is it really is so true. And even from, I'm not involved in that sector the way that you are. I'm more of an outsider and reporting on the politics of things. But even in the progressive space, seeing the like energy and zeal and enthusiasm that people were really happy to advocate for these things and for being honest and pointing out problems so that we can talk about the solutions to those problems and implement the solutions to those problems. The eagerness to do that during the previous coalition governments was like it was all happening, it was all there, and it really dropped off with Labor's election in 2022. There was a lot of messaging from Labor that, particularly around the net zero targets at that time, it's been the biggest increase in the targets that we've ever had. And yes, that is because you're lifting them basically from the floor that the coalition had them at. I've seen that dynamic shift a little bit with the most recent election and this term of government, which of course is just, has really just started. I've seen it shift a little bit, but not as much as I thought. There definitely is still a reluctance to just honestly point out, hey, we need to address this, and what we're doing isn't having the impact that we would like it to have for any number of reasons. And those reasons also don't necessarily have to be blame. Whatever we've done is not working the way we expected. So why is it so difficult to say that and ask for a change and ask for improvement and something better and to get better all of the time? It's much more difficult to have those conversations now. Even I can feel that.
Yeah, and I think the one thing to constantly highlight is that the criticism comes from knowing how close and realistic the better version of the policy is, right? And like, this is not really, it's not like one of those stretch goals where you're just pushing for the perfect outcome. It's you can kind of just fix a lot of these things by getting rid of the loopholes, get rid of carbon offsets from safeguard mechanism, tighten the settings of the vehicle efficiency standards, make sure that there's enough new wind and solar being built, and have better accountability mechanisms. I should just mention, I looked up the latest numbers from the Clean Energy Regulator a couple of days ago. Q3 for 2025 was the first quarter, as far as I can see, since at least 2015, if not longer, where 0 megawatts of new wind and solar were given final investment decision. And that's like I found that, and it shouldn't be down to some random guy in Oslo to to be like kicking up a stink about that, because that is a major problem. That there is such a low level of new wind and solar being constructed, way nowhere near enough to get to an 82% renewable energy share by 2030.
Yeah, that's something that the government itself should be on top of and proactively seeking to address as we move forward. I mean, if you were, for anyone who's watching or listening to this and who's not, as deep in the weeds of it as you are, what would you say would be like the one policy an announcement or adjustment, or what could be the one thing that people can look for or listen for that would let them know, hey, they are taking this seriously?
Yeah, it's got to be offsets in the safeguard mechanism. It's such a I wouldn't necessarily say that getting rid of offsets in the safeguard mechanism would indicate that they're taking it seriously, but it's just the bare minimum of when you should start going, okay, they've had a change of heart. They're actually they've changed their attitude, and they're really starting to shift in the right direction. It would just be getting rid of the ability to fake compliance with a stringent emissions target, and you actually have to reduce your emissions in real and material terms and report that to the government. And so the safeguard mechanism is a climate policy that applies to industrial polluters, and so that could be a big steel mill, but half of the polluters in that facility are fossil fuel exporters, coal and gas. By default, it actually does have an impact on the exports of Australia's fossil fuels as well, right? So a company could simply choose to export less coal and less gas to comply with its domestic, like its local emissions controls, because you would have less emissions if you're doing less coal and gas exporting. And so having carbon offsets in there has created this massive system of fakery. And I think that the government should have had an internal immune system against ever implementing something like this ever. The fact that it exists is alone such a major indictment, and I think a marker of total unseriousness. I think it continues to blow my mind. People have kind of forgotten about the policy. They've kind of not really, they're not really paying too much attention to it. I think the focus is rightly on the characteristics of the nature reform laws and how they relate to coal and gas extraction. But I think that the review of the safeguard mechanism is going to be starting soon, which they scheduled in when they first pushed for the policy. And this is really going to become a major topic again. And it should just be a no-brainer that you should not allow fake compliance with a regulation.
A very quick one. Australia and COP. Will it mean anything if we host the next COP conference? Or is that just putting a nice presentation on the fact that we maybe might look a little better than some of the hosts that have preceded us, and it's good PR spin? Is it still meaningful?
It would, of course, be very meaningful if Australia were to host, in the sense that it would invite a lot of new scrutiny on a government that has gotten away with a lot on the international stage for climate. They do exactly what the coalition government did before them, which is kind of run around with a bunch of like printouts of twisted data and say, look, we're doing fine, we're doing great. This happens every year, and I'm sure they're doing it again this year at COP30. But the valence of geopolitics here is actually really, really significant. So I live in Norway, and there was an article in the state broadcaster a couple of days ago that made me impossibly mad. It was about Brazil's hypocrisy, and this article, is written by a Norwegian journalist, and it was about Brazil allowing for the opening up of drilling in the Amazon, and basically saying, "Oh, isn't it hypocritical that a country that's hosting COP would be so brazen about opening up new fossil fuel extraction in the Amazon?" And the article failed to mention that Equinor, which is Norway's state-owned fossil fuel company, has just started production from the single largest oil field in Brazil since the year 2000, and it is Equinor's single largest foreign oil field anywhere on the planet, and they just started production a few days ago. And so when you look at the chart of like who's producing what in Brazil, Norway's state-owned fossil fuel company is a massive chunk of it. So
Wow.
I just bring that up as an example of the geopolitical dynamics, right? I live in a rich white country that has gotten rich from selling fossil fuels and is just storing all of that money up in a piggy bank, which we're investing in like awful tech companies and companies like manufacturing weapons for Israel and that sort of stuff. We are sort of seen as an example of like, oh, look, you can continue drilling for oil and then you can continue extracting gas and expanding both of those things and then use that money to fund the transition. But when that's not really what we're doing, right? We're not funding the transition, we're funding wealth. We're funding being rich. And so we present it as like, oh, yeah, we can have kindergartens and hospitals. But that's not what we use the money for. We use the money for our third car and our second home and buying a lot of stuff. Like, it's just ridiculous, right? And so Brazil is defending its fossil fuel extraction on the grounds of using that money to transition. Obviously, Brazil is not as rich as Norway is, but it aspires to have the same presentation and use fossil fuel extraction for the same thing. So I just mentioned that because I think that Australia, if it were to host, would basically see a flipping of similar dynamics, right? You sort of have this like, oh, Australia is so great. It's doing so well with renewable energy and solar in particular. But then there will be less of a focus on its fossil fuel extraction, and Australia will be really pushing to use it as a positive PR thing. Domestically, they'll be exposed because COP will cost a fair amount of money. And the government really wants to make sure that it's telling a very positive climate story if it does end up hosting. I have no idea what's actually going to happen, but I'm putting my money on a resolution simply not being reached. And in that case, it just defaults to Germany. It defaults to Bonn. A few people have commented to me that the government simply doesn't have its heart in hosting COP31 anymore, but they don't want it to go to Turkey, so they'll and
They're
maybe
staying in the
Turkey.
fight.
Yeah, and I think Turkey doesn't give a crap either way. I think they're just fighting for the fun of it, and I think that if COP ends up hosted in Germany, Australia can kind of walk out with its pride intact and go, well, yeah, we fought for it, but we didn't get it. So yeah, there's a chance that it simply doesn't end up in either country anyway by the end of the coming couple of weeks. We'll see.
Interesting. We'll keep an eye on that. Ketan, I want to end on this question, which is a little bit philosophical, but you are one of the few people that I know who is able to write climate stories in a way that people actually click and read. This is like the struggle in media, is to get people to read about climate, to get people to read climate journalism. Everybody says that they want it and they want more of it. On the back end, we can see people don't really read it. Except for your stuff. I'll link to a few of the articles in the episode description so people who haven't read can have a look. But I mean, there's always lots of engagement, heaps of comments, like people are genuinely consuming this. And so I want to ask, what do you see as the purpose and role of the type of climate journalism that you do now in this moment where things are so rapidly shifting? But there is so much to fight for. How and why do you keep doing it the way you do?
Yeah, and thank you. That's very, very, very kind of you.
It's
And
true. It's
I'm
there in the
glad.
numbers.
Yeah, and it's something that I really have been trying to do. I think it's because I was trained on social media, not traditional media. So I even when I was in my old like first job at a wind power company back in the 2010s, the first thing I did was use Twitter, and I think that it really trained me to always frame everything and put everything in a tone, particularly tone more than framing, that is compelling, that people feel a connection to, by making everything about physicality and real changes and trying to restore the connection between greenhouse gas emissions and the physical impacts that get reported on really regularly. This is something that I think that Norwegian media has not cracked. Like climate change is kind of just presented as like this thing that is happening in the sky that has no cause or no human beings that are behind its cause. And I feel like my entire goal is to completely restore that connective tissue between what decisions we make and the kind of impacts that we feel and experience. The general public has a fundamental sense that there is a connection there, but they feel like it's not being described or reported well enough. That's why there is such a massive audience still out there for climate stories. And I mean that really specifically. I think there's been like a trend recently to try and reframe what we do and what we talk about and what we fight for, in a way that is dropping the climate element, that is dropping, don't mention climate change or greenhouse gases or targets, blah, 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 because it's too nerdy or whatever. And I think that, yeah, there's a kind of like a valid criticism there that maybe it has been a little too technocratic at times. But again, it's all in service of something that is just real and material. And so I find myself arguing against my friends and colleagues a little bit more than I did in, the past decade. And it's because I think that retaining that connection is something that we have to fight for and defend really, really strongly. If I can just quickly give an example, I love renewables. I'm not sure if you can see it, but I've got my new Lego wind turbine behind me, sitting on the windowsill, which was given to me. I love renewable energy quite a lot, right? Like I think that like it's one of the few technologies that I have a strong bias towards. I feel strongly about, but you can deploy renewable energy in a way that doesn't reduce emissions, right? Like if demand is going up constantly and you just make no change to coal and gas, that is a really bad outcome, and it's something that you will very rarely see acknowledged or talked about, right? Like you won't see a large climate NGO saying, yeah, okay, it's good that we're getting a lot of solar, but is this actually reducing emissions? It's not something that has become a major focus, and I think it's because people want to tell a positive story. But I don't think that that's nourishing. I don't think that's what people are really after. It's sort of like it feels nice. It's like a bit of a sugar hit, but I think people want sense making around the time that we're in, and that sometimes means telling an angry story, not a pessimistic or an optimistic one, but an angry one. So framing everything as the potential good cases around the corner, but we're not doing it right. We need to do it better. That's an angry story, and I think people really do crave that because they want to feel like they have the agency to take action. And they absolutely do have agency. The entire project of fossil fuel propaganda over the past 2 decades has not been about pretending that climate science isn't real. It's been about removing agency from people. And every single thing that they've done has been in service of trying to induce the feeling that there is nothing you can do to stop this. And so when you talk about climate change in the context of agency and action, I think people click. I think people read. And it's not just me. There is many, many, many other people doing this. A nice example is Amy Westervelt at Drilled.
Yeah,
She's
fantastic.
one person who just comes to mind. Emily Atkin at Heated as well. And of course, there's just so many others. But these, like, I think we've formed a little coalition of sorts, because we don't describe this as solutions journalism, right? And I'm not a journalist, but I use the tools and the approaches of journalists when I'm doing my commentary on climate. It's not focused on solutions; it's focused on potential action and agency. I think that's a good way to do it.
Really quite an inspiring place to leave this. Not the inspiring note I thought we were going to end on, but I will absolutely take it. Ketan, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And yeah, we'll have lots more from you to come on Crikey in the coming weeks, I'm sure.
Of course, yes. Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of Cut Through, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating or review for the podcast. Crikey is 100% independent, which means your support powers our journalism.